Yes, I just gave you. Okay, you answered your own question.
Okay. Yeah, I just like pressed it. All right. Welcome back. Part two, Last Estate Book Club. We are doing part two of Demons. I have some weird camera. It's not totally in focus. But the P&V translation is the one I'm working on. As we talked about last time, not only is there several different translations, but several different titles. I'm going to start off by giving like the briefest of here's what I think happened in part two, and then we'll start talking about it. I think similar to part one, there's probably more to talk about in terms of like the ideas presented, and less in terms of like the plot or whatever, like, because again we are going to just walk into different living rooms and start conversations, so it's not like it's definitely not like action packed in that way, although there is one thing so all right, beginning into part one. We've got the shove or whatever, it kind of like ends in this little like weirdness. Everyone goes on to their own houses or whatever, and now in part two, everyone, with the notable exception, kind of is like staying in their place and seeing what's going to be the fallout from this event. Frankly, in the beginning of part two, I was kind of like, man, we're making a really big deal out of this event, like when like it didn't seem like that. But I think that sort of ties in a little bit to like the provincial stuff that we've talked about before, where like things that like maybe look like just somewhat minor in a town perhaps like as boring as this, and that comes up in a part here, take on this bigger weight, or this bigger meaning. But this part, the political the plot or whatever starts to unfurl, but it seems to me that it is almost entirely driven by the son, who is sort of the head of the group. I'm trying to get the name, Peter Stefanovich Verkhofinsky. I've got your Jesse's like list here printed out, but the son is now going around to all of the houses and trying to start these conversations, but it is not entirely clear, depending on whom he's speaking to, like that everyone even knows what's going on. And that part is a lot of what I like glommed onto and definitely want to talk about, because and I'll even like actually a little bit later probably relate it to some personal experience with this, which I think anyone of this time and era probably has, just because like William and I we've talked before in conjunction with Last Estate about what a major deal like Occupy Wall Street was to our generation in terms of like political thought, and also like the realities of like any sort of counter political movement or whatnot, like, and there were a lot of sort of interesting lessons there, whatnot, and this is happening here in Russia, in a very similar scale. So there's like a lot there in terms of like, it's this circle of people who have not just different motives, but also clearly different understandings of what is even going on. And now we have like kind of a mastermind here, the son who is trying to pull it all together. There is action-wise a very weird duel that is sort of incompetently done, but on purpose, but was like, literally like I had to go back through and then also look at another synopsis to be like, why are they fighting? Like, it was not totally clear to me why we needed to have a duel, other than I guess like, the tensions are all ratcheting up, right? And then there are just pages and pages of conversation about that is so coded, and again, different people in the room I think are hearing it different ways. And it sort of depends on like what you're in this circle was, and also like what your own sort of like what you're hoping to get out of it, right? Because there's definitely people within this group that are, I would say, just sort of typical social climbers, or like, they're into the literary salon aspect, or they're just, again, bored in a provincial town. And then there is, the more serious sort of political side there's even the general who, I think it's the general who is just like interested in it. Like he likes young people, you know? So like, he thinks it's like kind of like interesting to hear the way they talk. And he says that several times. So there's different kind of reasons to be around. And like, so I will just say briefly, like on that thing I alluded to, like, I really, really related to this. In my late teens, I lived in a punk rock house, right? Which is where you've got 20 people all living together. And there was a like political group living there, but I didn't understand that it was political. This was in Greensboro, North Carolina. The group is called Crime Think. It's now really like known, and it is an anarchist collective that is like significant in that world, right? And one of the people living there was this guy who had gone to University of Chapel Hill, but he was now older, and he was running Crime Think. And I, along with probably half of the house, thought we lived in like just a place that had house shows. And like, yes, people are vaguely political because you're 19, but like also you're just trying to get laid and like do drugs, you know, there's not like a whole lot of thought to it. And it wasn't until like sort of the end of my time living there, and then of course later with the eyes of like an actual adult, that you saw there was a whole nother group of people doing something totally different. And without any sort of judgment on like the effectiveness or belief in that or whatnot, like that part I kept coming back to as I read this stuff. Like when you're in those kind of group settings and you're like, oh, something else is going on here that is totally different than like what I kind of thought was happening. To where then by the end of part 2, it's totally clear, at least what the motives of the people, you know, of the son who's pushing this out are. And there's worker strikes, pamphleteering, like now we're pushing towards, I think, socialism. I mean, right? Like there's a huge section I'll talk about at some point about, that's my favorite part of it, where there's a great speech on socialism versus religion. But I think socialism is the ideology that is sort of being pushed there. Yeah, so that's what happened with part 2. My experience of reading it, so it's a little bit longer part. Still very funny, not quite, I thought, as funny and entertaining as page turning as part 1. I think that it missed a lot of, what's her name, like the Varvara. I missed her in this section, you know, like, and I really missed the play of, I mean, even the tutor, you know, like, I mean, he's in it and he's got some great lines in it, but like, he was just such a great comedic foil, and like their relationship was so good. And so like moving away from that and into like what I thought was pretty complicated to follow at times, sort of like scheming, wasn't quite as like page turning, but I do think that some of the best, like clearly some of the reasons that Dostoevsky probably wanted to write this book and everything else are shine through in this area. There's some fantastic like you know, sections on the political and on the religious. So that's like my sort of wrap up. Does anybody want to take something from there as I pull my tea?
I really liked, I think one of my favorite sections of part 2 was the meeting of our group at Virginsky's house, where you see how disorganized they were and how we need to take a vote on taking a vote, or we need to take a vote. Are we having a meeting? Let's have a vote to establish whether we're having a meeting or not, whether we're calling a meeting. And Stavrogan and Peter are like over it. They're like, and they get up and leave, and it's like they're the leaders, they're the ones with all the charisma, and they don't even care, you know. But I thought that was really comical, and it makes you surprised that revolutions even happen, because people are so usually kind of disorganized, and everyone's going in a different direction. I really like that part.
Yeah, I have that written down too, like page 398. Are we meeting or not? Like I loved that line. And it's about, even at 403, so a few pages later, there's somebody saying, if you can't hold your system together and can't describe it, then how are we supposed to go on with it? Like to your point about how does a revolution even occur?
Right. And it seemed like there was, this is how I started to think about it, was like part one was like the whole world outside the group, the social life, the salons, the kind of society of the town. And then the second part was like getting into the circle, but then there's like a circle within the circle.
Mm-hmm.
And the circle within the circle are the ones that are actually plotting to do violence, you know. Whereas the kind of intermediate circle has more broader, perhaps maybe less violent ideas, you know. I'm really fascinated by Stavrogan because I read the biography of Dostoevsky about this particular time, and the guy gives really interesting perspectives on, for example, the conversations that happen at the beginning of part two, where Stavrogan is going and he talks to Kirillov, and then he talks to Shatov, and they're having all these discussions about God. And what was really interesting in the biography was talking about how those people kind of represented aspects of Stavrogan's personality that he had discarded. So it's kind of like he's the one in the lead, and everyone's kind of following behind him to try to like embody things that he said like years ago. And he's just such a weird character. I had a question, maybe we're jumping ahead, but did all of you reading, did you have the section called at Tikhon's or Stavrogan's Confession in your book?
No, I did not.
Where he goes to talk to a
Actually,
monk.
So, Derek, if you're reading the Pever and Walahowski translation, you do. It's an appendix, though. What happened, if I remember, and I ended up. It's supposed to be in part two. It's supposed to be chapter 9 of part 2, but I read the same translation as you initially, and I ended up reading it after everything.
Yep.
And it does provide. It provides context that helps to understand a thing I don't want to talk about that happens at the very end of the novel that doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense without reading that appendix. And what it is without spoiling that chapter, basically, well, I'll spoil it a little bit. The chapter basically contains a rape, and the Russian censors at the time were like, you can't include this in the novel. And Dostoevsky cut the chapter. And with that chapter cut, I think the culmination of the novel makes less sense. And it makes a lot more sense once you go and you read that chapter and you see what happened in this character's past.
So is the idea with it being in the appendix that, at least for the P&V translation, they're like being more faithful to the original as it was originally read? You know what I mean? Because it seems like putting it in the body of the text is more faithful to what Dostoevsky's like aims were.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure why the decision was made to include it in the appendix. I think one thing is that I think it wasn't in most earlier translations, and I could be wrong, but the ones that are called like the Possessed, like the Constance Garnett translation, I think are missing that chapter entirely. So I think this was kind of, like you said, a way to preserve the integrity of the book as it's usually been translated into English, but also include add back in this, I think, pretty essential piece of section of the book.
See, I have the Garnet, I believe, and I don't have an appendix, so I think it's just missing.
Yeah, mine has got it. They put it in the spot that it was supposed to go. And it's really crucial to understand that character because he explains his sort of past and the horrific things that he's done. Anyway, another thing I really thought was really interesting, and Derek, you kind of touched on it, was these people are radicals and they're revolutionaries and they're borderline criminals, but certain people in the larger society actually kind of like them or feel like they're fashionable and want to rub elbows with them. Like I'm thinking of Yulia Mikhailovna, von Lemke, the wife of the administrator. I think Dostoevsky might have been kind of pointing out that like radicals are chic, and there's something kind of like attractive. And another thing, the pamphlets, her husband, the administrator or governor or
Governor, yeah.
He collects the pamphlets, and it's his hobby. So on some level, they're maybe misunderstood because they're treated like they're not the radicalism isn't really fully understood. It's treated like it's like a fashion or like a hobby, a thing for people to read about.
Well,
It's
I
not
think
a
that makes
secret,
sense. I think that makes sense in the way that these things truly unfold. Like getting back to what you're saying about how revolution even kind of comes about, like people wanted to be around them. Like there was an energy. And like in that first part, like it's not clear what the energy is going to be like released to do. Do you know what I mean? Like, but you kind of want to be around the magneticism or the energy, or just sort of this feeling that something's going on, like, and we've all entered those spaces where you just get that sense, like that there's something here. And maybe there is an element there of Dostoevsky, like, oh, this is how you pull in people who might otherwise not be like prone to the kind of violence.
Yeah.
There's also a sense when the wife and the administrator kind of talk about the kids doing the pamphlets and having the revolutionary thoughts, that they're like, oh, it's good that we hang out with them so that they don't go over the edge.
Right.
So there's a sense of duty that they have as well, as if like by showering them with like gifts and nice things and these sorts of things that like, oh, that'll make it so that they're not too radical. They're still kind of chic in this kind of way.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of discussion between, especially Fyodor and the administrator guy about this kind of dynamic.
Actually, I thought about that too in terms of like modern day liberal Democrats versus a far left, or even I'm sure you could say, maybe like a centrist, whatever in this country as well, compared to a far right. Like there is that sort of appeasement of like, well, if we are, like just bring these people in and we're nice to them, then like this will curtail any of their like worst impulses or whatever,
Absolutely. Reading those pages reminded me of Bernie Hillary, right?
Yeah.
Like it felt very much like that.
Yeah, I get the sense Bernie is going to, in that metaphor, whatever, will win in this book, or will at least have more of a brighter moment in part 3. Like, there's not like there is a real ineptitude on all parts, really. But it does seem like if there is any skill in politics, it is coming from the son. It is coming from the schemer, and like I do get a sense that he's going to, in whatever way he's going to define success, like probably win out. I don't know. I shouldn't predict ahead.
I think Dostoevsky though is saying beware. I mean, he's saying it's funny to watch the moderate people try to rein in the really radical people by saying, oh, we'll keep contact with them and we'll keep them under watchful eye and everything like that. But I think Dostoevsky is saying that's not enough, and there is a real danger on multiple levels from these people. And even though they are kind of bumbling in Virginsky's meeting, and it seems like nobody can organize anything, I think he's saying Russia's in serious danger.
Yeah.
From all this, both politically and theologically,
And was that echoed in the biography?
Yes, he was very concerned, apparently. Another thing that's interesting is that he wrote this novel mainly when he was in Europe. And he was just inhaling Russian newspapers about this particular case. I think it's called the Nechayev case, where a guy had started a group of 5, like a secret organization, And in order to bond them together, they plotted to kill one of them that was sort of suspected of maybe denouncing them. And it really happened. And I listened to a podcast and they said it's not like this was 9/11, but to them this was like a major news thing that everybody talked about. All kinds of stuff came out in the trial. It was in the paper for a long time. And Dostoevsky just like absorbed these newspaper accounts of this murder trial and this group and put that in the book, because he saw them as a real big threat to another thing I thought was really interesting was the discussion with Shatov, where Shatov is saying every country has its own god. Every, like the ancient Romans, well, they had gods, but they had their own like god idea. And the French Revolution had its own god idea. And Russia is going to have one too that's going to be like the deciding factor for all of humanity. And I thought that was really, really interesting. And going back to the thing we talked about last time with, you know, the resentment felt by some people in Russia that Europe had a lot of influence over Russian ideas, and that there was like a westernized negative influence on Russia coming from Europe. And in some ways this radicalism kind of owed something to that too, I think.
So that's like 250, and honestly the part that I liked the most is that speech. And in particular, there's lines in my translation that I've got underlined, and I actually will make a small political point of my own if you'll like indulge me in that. But I love this. The aim of all movements of nations, of every nation and in every period of existence, is solely the seeking for God, its own God, entirely its own, and faith in him is the only true one. God is the synthetic person of the whole nation, taken from its beginning and to its end. It has never yet happened that all or many nations have had one common God, but each has always had a separate one. It is a sign of a nation's extinction when there begin to be gods in common. And well, one makes sense because this ties it, but the next line, when there are gods in common, they die along with the belief in them and with the nations themselves. That could be capitalism so freaking easily. And I hate being like that because I hate it when like people are like, late capitalism. I mean, it's just so like, it's a nauseatingly empty and vapid usually take on stuff. But in modernity, like the common God is clearly capitalism, right? And like, it's interesting to think that like, if you do all have this one system, then like it ceases to be a God, and nations cease to distinguish themselves from one another, and then a nation dies, you know, like, and I don't even know if I agree necessarily with Dostoevsky's point there, but like I thought that was really apropos for today. But it's just that, again, my only political point here, that the God is probably, you know, the dollar.
I like that take a lot, in particular because the part that follows after the part that you read is around this this kind of like play on words as to whether or not he's thinking about God as an attribute of a nation, or rather a nation being risen up to the level of God. And in how I'm understanding your interpretation about capitalism, it is as if capitalism has become godlike, right? And so I think it's true to that.
Yeah. And I liked he definitely sees in that same thing earlier in that speech. I don't know, again, if I believe this is true or not, but he seems socialism is tied to science and reason, and therefore cannot be the God. Is that essentially what, I mean, is that what everybody felt like he was saying there? Like socialism can't be the unifying factor because it is based on reason, and therefore, I mean, what's to follow there is the idea, I guess, that like you can't have faith in a system the way that you can have faith in a, you know, something more ethereal or whatnot.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Okay. I mean,
You got it.
Okay. Awesome. Well, as all of our systems continue to fail throughout the modern world, that, I mean, it seems to check out. It seems like he might have been onto some things. All right, there's one. Okay, there's one other place I wanted to go that ties into something we were talking about earlier about why people come into the thing and some of the provincialism. But I also felt personally attacked by this line on 405. Well, I'll just do the speech he says. But when I said it was nonsense, I didn't mean Shigagalov. Sorry, I'm terrible at this stuff. Like, mumbled Verkovinsky. You see, gentlemen, he raised his eyes a bit. I think all these books, these Fourier's, Cabot's, all these right to work, Shologovisms, it's all like novels of which 100,000 can be written, an aesthetic pastime. I understand that you're bored in this wretched little town, so you fall on any paper with writing on it. And I mean, that is just a little harsh there, you know, for somebody that's completely addicted to literature and like from both ends of the spectrum, but really fun. And like, again, it like comes back to something as simple as boredom. It's like, you're bored, you want a revolution. It's just like reading a book or doing a play, or like nowadays we would say it's like watching it on TV, or how we're having a war unfold on our phones. You know, like it's sort of like this participatory thing where you don't have any real skin in the game. Again, you're just bored. Like, and I really, again, attacked personally on the novel front, but also just like definitely liked that, yeah, exactly. But like how people low key want World War III, or I mean, in general, down here, down south where I'm from. I mean, it's even, you know, since I was born, most of the religious fervor around me has been generated from revelations and from this idea that you know, there's going to be, during our lifetime, everyone thinks the world is going to end in their generation, in their lifetime, you know, like, and the like base truth of it is like, most likely no, you know. And like, to some people, I think that's actually a sad thought. Like, and I think that there's a depression in like, you mean I'm just going to have this existence? And it's like, yes. You know, like you are actually not going to watch the Four Horsemen or whatever like come down. But I, from a very, I mean, you know, for a very early age, have been in those rooms where that's, you know, the religious fervor that they're talking about is one of, this is going to be the end. And yeah, it's sort of all around that kind of sort of innate vision of ours that like we are going to be involved while we're around in something that is monumentally cataclysmic or changing. And for most people, that's not going to be the case. Most people that live.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff that surrounds the salons and like the literature that's kind of in the book, you know, the way they depict literature. Like you were talking about with that, the quote you just read, you know, it seems like doom scrolling, basically, you know, sort of on the Twitter timeline. It's the same type of function. You can see it. It's like, well, yeah, that desire for, you know, to fill a hole, but it's like this emptiness, you know, that doesn't, yeah, you can't fill it, basically. And that's the thing you were saying with like the apocalyptic thing, where it's like, well, everybody expects shit to end in their lifetime, and you're kind of anticipating that, but it's just not it's just not kicking off. And that's something that, like, it seems like a lot of the political discussion in this novel focuses around that. Like, I mean, that idea, like you're like using politics as a way to fill that kind of emptiness.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there does seem to be too, like a siphon from boredom to that, you know, like just like with doom scrolling. I mean, I'm picking up most likely my phone in a bored moment, right? And then an algorithm is going to decide, Derek, you shall be angry. Derek, you shall be sad. Derek, you shall be happy. You know what I mean? And then it like really all depends on like what I'm being shown in that moment. Like, oh, Derek, you should get into a conflict. You know what I mean? Because you know, in your world here, like your kids just fought or whatever, and then you see something stupid on the timeline, and now you know what I mean, like, and you're throwing your energies there, like, and there is, like, most of the time, again, for me, like a lot of people, like, I mean, from 9 to 5, like my phone is like work, like most people, but in other times, like it's just this boredom device, you know, and it just, like, that's one of the things that like brings me to these books so much, because it's such a more effective and like soothing, actually, and probably healthy boredom device. But it's still sort of the same thing where it's like, I'd like to not have my own thoughts right now, give me someone else's, you know. That went to a direction, right? Like, we didn't need all that, but
I think it's really interesting that you bring up things like Twitter, or like the way information is disseminated in our world. Last time Manny brought up that texting was sort of like an analogous thing to this thing of letters that people pretend not to have read. And I think, if you, maybe this is too reaching or too facile or something like that, but the pamphleteering, the pamphlets in this novel, and then reading what I read about how Dostoevsky just like was so absorbed in these newspaper accounts of this murder case in Russia. I mean, the pamphlets, it's kind of like that's the analogous thing to what you're just talking about. This was how information was spread, and it got people excited, and it got people thinking doom-like thoughts, you know,
and heroic thoughts too, right?
what's that?
And heroic thoughts too, right? Like, you could be a part of something. That's definitely got to be a pull for some aspects.
Well, yeah, I think. You know, I was also thinking, and sorry if this is a jump, but I remember I saw, I think it was on YouTube somewhere, this is like years ago, an interview with a guy who had been part of, like, basically you could call it the Weather Underground, and or some kind of connected radical group in the United States. This guy, he was white, but he got hooked up with like black radical groups in the 60s and 70s, and he got involved in doing bank robberies with them. And in the course of one bank robbery, there was someone got killed, and he got arrested, and he's probably still serving life somewhere in a federal penitentiary in the United States. But they had an interview with him, and all the shit that he said was so logical and seemed to make perfect sense because of the way he was kind of describing it. And it made me think of, you know, it seems like one of the themes that Dostoevsky's getting at is that there's this scary idea that people with the really big ideas are going to like pick up a gun and do something, and but it's this sort of hyper rational belief, you know.
There was like one thing on 455 I highlighted that's exactly that, but where Stefan Chermovich says the idea is great, but those who profess it are not always giants. Et brisson l'eau, mon cher. And then mine actually gives me the French, thank God, because like despite my strong Duolingo streak, I can't read French very well. And let's break off there, my dear. And he's addressing his son there. Like, the ideas are great, but like people are not grand, you know. And I mean, that fits into the Dostoevsky. I mean, that fits into Crime Punishment I've read before. You know, the other Dostoevsky idea is that like it's people. You know, it's our humanity that is going to, you know, sully anything of this idea. And like, if we act, I guess, following sort of the logic of what you're saying, if we act on these great ideas with a violence or something, like that's not going to get us to the place. I mean, I think that's somewhat at least what he's saying. Like, but at least in that moment, like there is an acknowledgement of like, yes, I see why this idea has enthralled you.
I think that one thing that's interesting is the way in which, the beginning of the salons, a lot of the things that we have discussed here already, the salons and kind of some of the reasons why people might be interested in kind of people with revolutionary thoughts or these ideas themselves. And that the kind of first real action outside of, like, of course, the slap from the last one, but agreed that it was kind of like, that is the big thing that everybody is talking about, but it feels so minuscule in particular in comparison to the big ideas that people are espousing. But then one big thing that happens is at the end of this part where there is this labor riot, right?
Mhm.
And the ways in which all of the different characters end up interacting with the labor riot. Either they denounce it and are like, no, this is terrible, or they're out there like pamphleteering. And I think there is this passage, I don't remember where it is exactly, where it's talking about the people on the ground that are actually protesting the conditions and everything like that. They're not part of the movement. In fact, they're described as people who aren't really even thinking about these ideas. And so the thoughts actually came after the action rather than the action coming after the thoughts, which is kind of like what the book seemed to have been setting us up for some time.
Yeah, I mean, I love that point because I think it's absolutely evergreen throughout like movements in country, where frankly, like the lower class is usually used as a tool, right? By, an academic class or an upper class to like institute their gains. It was one of the like, there was a fantastic after party once at Misery Loves Company where the topic of the truck driver strikes in Canada came up, right? And it was just fantastic because you had like a brilliant Croatian arguing with Josh Sherman, the resident Canadian, and like a total like talking past each other on like what or not understand. Actually, I think Kiko understood perfectly, but Sherman did not understand perfectly exactly like what the conversation was about. But there was that same element there of like these truck drivers were, protesting or whatever, but like they weren't protesting for the same ideals that were okay. Do you know what I mean? To a left or to a liberal audience or whatever. Like they were protesting something that a liberal or a left would find, you just get back into your truck. Don't worry about like whatever. And I feel like that happens like throughout history where it's like there's this movement of something like a very specific issue, like you want different working conditions or you're pissed about vaccinations or whatever, and like the actual cause doesn't match up with the ideology that one that sort of like the interlopers, like the people coming in, want to like espouse. And so it's oftentimes like it kind of gets warped into whatever their vision is.
It makes me think of in Egypt, I think it was in 2011, the Arab Spring revolution, the revolutions that were spreading throughout the Arab world, and the way that like the people that were driving it were like very tech savvy students who really knew how to harness the power of social media to bring out people into the streets. And then in order to get bodies, they used the Muslim Brotherhood to like network further and get more body masses out on the street. But then when the revolution happens, the Muslim Brotherhood like take ownership of, and this, I mean, I guess the same thing happened in Iran.
Yep.
You know what I'm saying? Like
Same thing.
so, and it's interesting in Devils, Demons, The Possessed, that scene where the workers, there's this idea that there's just a gap between the people with the motivating ideas and the masses. There's a distance between them that they're always, the revolutionaries, radicals are always trying to bridge and make it to that sweet spot with the masses to get them to riot and put pressure on society. And I think that's another thing Dostoevsky's criticizing is the people with the big ideas don't know the first fucking thing about the masses in Russia. And Tolstoy kind of talks about this too. Like nobody knows what it's like to be the actual guy cutting the wheat out in the field and living the pure peasant life, And this is something, I live in upstate New York, and there's a lot of people coming from downstate to come and like get in touch with the rural folk and like try to emulate them, dress like them, do their activities and stuff like that. And it's just funny sometimes to see the way they want to bring. It becomes this whole thing. We don't need to talk about that. But I think you get what I'm saying. You know?
Yeah, I do. And I actually like see, like having grown up in actual, rural setting, then living now, like in the outskirts of a major city, right? Like, but a major city in the South. So there's all of that happening here all the time. Like, the F-150 huge, whatever, like, like this sort of like, almost rural fashion, you know what I mean? But by extremely, well-to-do, six-figured, whatever people. I mean, it's definitely sort of like, just like there's a fashion with the radicals, there also is that like romanticization of the the guy out there doing the weed.
Yeah.
I think the way it's made fun of, this is how I interpret it. I could be wrong. This like how detached the ideas are from like the actual action. I think it's in that meeting scene where they're like figuring out like if they're actually having a meeting, where it's like the first time that they're actually going to sit down and like talk about an idea and like what their beliefs actually even are, not just like socialize and these sorts of things. And they kind of come up with the Shigalyovism, right? And basically like the heart of that idea is like, is this guy sad or not? We should form a utopia around whether this one guy who's already in despair is going to be happy or not in whatever society. Like that is their basis. So it's even their idea is detached from the populace. It's just like one of their own, and whether or not it's going to be something that they should care about.
That's fantastic, and not a connection I had made at all, right? Like, yeah, like that personal existential crisis then being fostered upon like an entire nation. There was something you said there that that reminded me I wanted to hit on. Oh yeah, that whole scene, which I know we talked about a couple of times, but I think it's definitely like the funniest and most memorable pull out of part two. But it reminded me of the Abbott and Costello "Who's on First" routine. I mean, and I remember, I think William said this last time, and I've definitely read it somewhere, where Nabokov, who we were talking about before we hit record actually, but Nabokov had said Dostoevsky should have been a playwright or something. And right, like I think that was like his interpretation or whatever of all the work. That whole scene would have made an incredible play. Like you can see it, even me who's not a visual person can see like them in the salon, like having this, are we having a meeting? Are we not? Like, and it is extremely comical. And then, I mean, kind of repeated, like now that's sort of like back and forth and whatever, like not saying he invented it, but that's definitely like a trope or whatever. All right, I'm looking at my notes to see if I had anything else I wanted to definitely say. We don't understand it ourselves, page 399, below that. Okay, I mean, there's like literally 20 pages of like, do we understand this? Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I really liked this line on 386, where they're kind of talking about like why some of the ideas like that are more nihilistic kind of keep people interested. And it's this kind of line, which is like, that essentially our teaching is a denial of honor, and that it's easiest of all to carry the Russian man with us by an open right to dishonor. That like this is kind of like part of what makes it kind of chic and cool, that it's like you have the right to basically be dishonorable, be despicable, and these sorts of things, and that's what kind of gives it its like particular cachet. Maybe it's what makes it dangerous too, but it's which that seems to be what Dostoevsky thinks and whatnot. But I liked that kind of sentiment, that like this might be kind of part of the heart of what makes it sexy.
And we saw that here with the dirtbag left, like that became like an idea, right? Like that, like part of the fun was that you could say, the F word or whatever, you know what I mean? Like part of the fun was that you could be naughty, and be dishonorable and be disreputable, like, yeah, that's really fun. That's a really good pull. The only other thing I was gonna say on there that I didn't hit is, I think in the introduction I talked about that, but on page 429 he does say, Stefan Trifonovich, tell me as a friend, I cried out, as a true friend, I won't betray you. Do you belong to some secret society or do you not? And now, to my surprise, even here, he was not certain whether he was or was not a participant in some secret society. Yeah, like just the idea that like that's how like the Rolling Stone can gather moss or whatever metaphor, you know what I mean? Like that's how like these sort of energies come together to create something. Like even he himself was not sure. And there's not even an element there of desire. It doesn't say he wasn't sure if he wanted to be in a secret society. Like it is more as if like, if you're hanging out with these people, then you de facto are a member of a secret society. And I put notes in that on that one, because that also reminds me of today, where it's like, if you don't stay in an ideological lane, or if you don't stay like with people who are fashion wise, not clothes, but fashion wise of the same sort of sensibilities, then it seems as if you are then a member of some other secret society, like where your actual sort of like in there, same with him, his values, his beliefs, his motives, his desires are really irrelevant. You know what I mean? It's more of the sense of like, well, if you're with them, if you're not with them, you're against them, whatever, that whole thing. Like, I like that. Even he did not know, not that he didn't want to, like, not that he hadn't considered, like, it was just like a foregone conclusion of like, I'm not sure if I'm in a secret society. I guess that's for someone else to tell me.
I read that, but I don't remember that scene. Is he talking about Stavrogan, or is he talking about Peter, or who's the he in that?
He is Trotvonovich, and it's the narrator saying, he was asked by if he was in a secret society, and the narrator pops in and is just saying real quick, even in that moment, he didn't know. Right.
Those two guys are Stavrogan and Peter Trofimovich are kind of driving everything, but I noticed at various points they really seemed aloof from everything, and they had the charisma, but they were like, especially Stavrogan is like I said, was kind of over it all, and this is my suggestion. You don't have to follow it, but you should read the appendix about how he goes to talk to the monk about his life.
Part 3.
Yeah, because read it as if you're reading it how it was originally intended, where that chapter is.
And where was it at? What chapter?
Well, it's supposed to be chapter 9 of part 2.
Okay.
And it's after the chapter which in my book is called Ivan the Tsarevich.
Okay, I've got that one. I've got, Ivan the Tsarevich. I've got that. And then it goes for me right into Stefan Trifonovich perquisitioned.
Right. In mine, it's called The Search at Stepan Trifonovich. That was an interesting chapter too, where he was so paranoid about the pamphlets being discovered. Yep. And I think it's the narrator going like, don't, just chill out, don't worry about it, but Stepan is like really scared of being accused of being some kind of radical because he's got the pamphlet.
He's scared, I think, of the social scandal aspect of it, right? Like that was his.
Yeah.
Like it didn't seem like he was scared of the political, like he was more just like, will I be outcast? Like, will I be seen this way? Like he's still operating in that same salon, like that's where
what's
like
important to him.
Yeah. That's what's important to him is like the name, and will he be canceled? Yeah. I don't, does that exist anymore? I saw a thing the other day that said Dave Chappelle High School Theater no longer named after him. And I thought about writing something about like, oh man, the cancellations are getting real serious. Because it's like anyway. That's a complete non sequitur to end on as we hit close to 10. Does anybody have anything else they want to wrap up on this so we go to part 3? Jesse, are you into part 3 yet?
I finished the book. I read it. Yeah.
So you
Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say, so you can tell when I'm completely full of it, like as I try to predict where we're gonna go.
Well, it gets darker. It's still funny, but it gets much bleaker. And there's a really interesting chapter about Stepan where he kind of winds up. That is really important. That it'll be interesting to hear what people think of that in the third session. Yeah, I think it's just really interesting to think about how Dostoevsky was like, the Russian Orthodox Church is not enough. I mean, he believed in it, but it couldn't be. He didn't want Christianity to be like some Russified thing. He wanted it to be like for the entire planet. And
I mean, so did he have a prescription?
what do you mean?
Like, so are you saying he wanted the Russian Orthodox Church to be like,
Well,
was that the answer to the proposed problem of socialism, of ideology? Was that his sort of,
well, remember we were talking about how the Shatov had the idea that there would be like a kind of God idea for each nation, and that was closer to what Dostoevsky believed, but I think he thought that was not enough, or there was something problematic about it being just an idea for Russia, that Christianity would be just limited to a nation or something. There's some kind of problem there.
Yeah, I miss all of like the Russian specific, like I just, none of it falls on me because I never studied it, and never, I just like don't know that aspect. I was really interested last time with Sophia, like having that perspective, because like I feel like I miss out on a lot of that. Although this time I was able to see, I think, more of that European, like, because of our first talk, I was able to see that like the influence is spreading and is a cause for, a specter of concern.
I also think that we're talking about apocalypticism, or the apocalypse, and the apocalypse never seems to arrive. And I think in Russia, maybe there was this sort of feeling like something was coming, something big, something political, some kind of uprising, and it just took like 50 more years for it to kind of really become a real revolution. But there were things in the air. That's what I'm reading about,
Yeah.
And it did have like a religious kind of connotation for certain people,
I think about that point of the 50-year, like most of my adult Jesus, most of my adult life has felt similar in America, not as, but has felt like, oh, there's something sort of coming, I was, well, I don't know how old must I have been, 20, close to it, at 9/11. So you start with 9/11, and then you go with like sort of the sequence of events then to include, the war, recession, Trump era, pandemic, just like these things sort of building on top of each other, where at all these points you feel like something is going to happen. But 50 years, which could be it, right, is such a short amount of time. Like it's only a long amount of time, like when you're the one living. Do you know what I mean? But like he was correct that something was about to happen, something awful. And like many of the things it seems like that he warned against, came to fruition in Russia.
Yeah. It just took like many, many decades for it to kind of develop.
But it's like in that way he sort of saw it, right? Like, he saw it down. That's what like some great novelists can do, right? They've got the sense of the people and the times enough. It's just that it takes a long time, I think, for it to totally ferment.
I mean, that's one way to look at it. A more cynical way to look at it, though, is that, the Russian population had Dostoevsky, had one of the greatest novelists ever warning them about this outcome, and we still got the Russian Revolution, and we still got Lenin and Stalin, and and tens of millions of bodies. And so it kind of in some ways also highlights the like inadequacy of art to like serve as any kind of like real political check or any kind of real potent political warning, you know?
That is a
Except maybe
great,
to
like,
the individual.
I
Maybe
would
the
love to
individual can.
think about that, and like, or not think, like, I'd love to see if there's ever been examples where art has stemmed something societal like that, because I would think not, right? Like, because of how you just ended there on the individual, like, it doesn't seem to have the power, or at least it's not harnessed that way, you know, to stem the tide, which is depressing. Thanks for the more cynical view.
Well, I mean, the optimistic bit to tack onto my cynicism, though, is that like Dostoevsky's work still can have a transformative experience for the individual, right?
Right.
Like even with the Russian Revolution having come and gone, even with the Soviet Union having collapsed before I was, no, not before I was born, but relatively soon after I was born. Like even with all that, this novel is full of shit that speaks to the contemporary moment, right? That speaks to stuff I've experienced in my life. So I do think that like there is power there, like that it can offer something lucid for the individual, even if societies are always going to like, you know, stumble ass over elbows from one cataclysm to another.
It takes literature a long time. All right, I'm going to close it up. In 2 weeks we'll do part 3, so less of a break here, and then yeah, I'm excited about it. I'm excited to see where the hell this is going to go. I get to be off all next week, so I only get to focus on reading, which is awesome. I'm going to hit this